Thank, thank you, Jack, and thank you everyone who is listening to this and watching it. So there is some connection to Rosamund's story in that this one, I'm afraid, is also about death and starts with a relative's death. It starts, in fact, on the 16th of October, 2017. When a bomb placed under my mother's car seat was detonated by 3 men in Malta. So I know the exact time that the bomb went off, 2:58 p.m. It was a Monday afternoon. And I know the exact SMS that was used to trigger the bomb. So hash REL1 equals on. So I know these details because for the past 6 years, my 2 older brothers and I have been campaigning for justice for my mother. So we've been in and out of court across 3 criminal proceedings, countless constitutional cases, and the country's first public inquiry. I know more details, and I know them by now like the back of my hand. Also because I've spent the past 3 of those 6 years writing a book about my mother. So the one Jack mentioned, it's called A Death in Malta. But it turned out to be about a lot more than my mother's assassination. And over the writing, I realized it should be more than that. And it's really a book about the fullness of her life and the three boys she brought up. And it's also about this tragic arc of her life that I realized over the writing maps in a really eerie way onto the arc of our country's history, which I see as quite tragic. And it's also about the campaign I mentioned that my brothers and I have been on ever since 2017, and how ultimately the goal of that campaign is to sort of bend that arc to a very different place. So my mother was born in 1964, so just 2 weeks before Malta became independent from Britain. And for the first few years of her life in the 60s, it looked like the country would fulfill those promises it made itself around independence, that it would be free and affluent and successful and, in a word, independent. But then in the early 70s, as was the fashion around the world in newly formed states, the country turned inward. So it elected a very socialist government that began closing off the economy in order to grow domestic industry, began restricting foreign travel, and turning away from the West and towards the Soviet Union, China, Libya. And my mother's world, just as she was growing up in the 70s, began closing in. And she began feeling quite isolated and disaffected. So, you know, I remember my mother telling us, "You don't know how lucky you are. You boys, when I grew up, there was only one brand of chocolate available, one type of toothpaste, one type of casual shoe, which would all have to dye different colors." But the outside world, or the West, really became available to my mother through these foreign magazines my maternal grandparents used to subscribe to. And I say in the book, my maternal grandmother, who was still alive when I was writing it, told me, you know, we used to subscribe to everything: The Spectator, Newsweek and Punch. And I thought, it's not really everything, but it brought to my mother this view of a really different way of living. All those kind of principles of capitalism, freedom, and those ideas seem to have taken root. And she also began thinking more broadly about writing, that she began asking why the writing in those publications was so different to what she read around her in Malta, which was much more conservative, always anonymous, and never very challenging. And over time, that love of reading gave way to one of writing, but not before she met my father, quite young, and had us 3 boys, again quite young. So by the time she was 24, she had all of us. But then began, as you might imagine, feeling quite bored and fed up at home. So began writing part-time for a magazine. And I always remember being with her as a boy. And my father worked as a lawyer and was out of the house quite a lot. And in fact, I remember them coming home, in a row. And apparently my father had said something like, the good thing about having had 3 boys in quick succession is that they brought themselves up. And of course it wasn't the case at all. We were always with my mother. So she began writing for the newspapers, really in the late 80s, but she got her column in 1990 on the Sunday Times of Malta. So she was the first woman to write a column, and also the first columnist to write under their own byline. So everyone else in the country wrote anonymously, even up to 1990, out of fear of violent reprisals or any other kind of reprisal, really. So very quickly, the journalism came home. So in 93, 94, she was reporting on a drug trafficker whose father was the brigadier. And the suspicion was always that it was the brigadier who'd help his son bring drugs into the country. Anyway, that was her first big story, I suppose. And we of course didn't know it at the time. I was about 6 or 7. But I remember at a point my mother bringing us home from school, and we found one of our dogs lying dead across the doorstep in a pool of her own blood. So she was a border collie we call Messalina. And my mother telling us, don't worry about Messalina, she ate snail poison, which had happened with a Labrador we had. It was only until much later, in fact, when I was about 16, that my father told me, no, someone slit her throat. And this was a few weeks after that our front door, our wooden front door, went up in flames. And I remember it perfectly. And I also remember my mother telling us, don't worry about it. I just drop a lit candle against the front door. And again, my brothers and I grew up seeing all these things because we were always with her, either driving around or at home. And in large part, because of the book, I had to revisit all of these memories and weirdly developed an almost parallel childhood, in the sense that the original memories are still there, but now there's this other layer. And I, speaking to my father and my grandparents for the book, I realized just how much more of it there was that I don't even remember. So she used to take us to a more rural island. Sometimes in the middle of school, she'd just pull us out of school, take us on the ferry, and we'd spend a week, even in the middle of winter, on what's a kind of summer resort island. And then I realized those trips, those what we thought were holidays always coincided with a very difficult period of reporting for her. And it was only again much later that I look back on these little things, like the way she would approach her car in the morning before taking us to school, and that she was already then in the 90s nervous about a bomb being put underneath it. And then, of course, when I was older, like late teens, these things became directly obvious to me. When I was about 17, so around the time I was doing my A-levels, there was another arson attack on the house, this time a lot worse. So stacks of used car tires, bottles filled up with petrol put at the back of the house. And again, around the time she was reporting on quite a difficult subject, so Malta's first really far-right party, which had developed in response to asylum seekers looking to land in Malta. So this was around 2006, and Malta had just joined the EU 2 years earlier, so it became very attractive to people looking to claim asylum. And so this is what I mean or meant earlier about the tragic arc. So joining the EU was always very important to my mother and to us. So my mother campaigned a lot for it because she saw it as the answer to Malta's problems, the silver bullet that would solve all these issues of governance, of human rights. That would bring Malta closer to that world she used to read about as a girl in foreign magazines. But in the end, or in retrospect, rather, something else happened in that Malta did globalize and did become a lot richer, but remained with the same rickety institutions that we had really since 64. So when we decolonized, there was some constitutional reform, but not the kind that we would need to deal with huge inflows of money, really serious problems of corruption, and a very powerful executive. And for my mother, that meant that she went from reporting on very Maltese corruption, so the drug trafficker, what he was doing, other people trying to bribe Maltese police officers, Maltese judges. So she went from that to reporting on kickback schemes running into the billions of euros or dollars, flows coming from post-Soviet states, from the Gulf. And it happened weirdly, imperceptibly, because the changes in Malta have been so fast. And this was, in fact, one of those stories that she was working on at the time of her death. So in 2016, through the Panama Papers leak, found that two very senior Maltese politicians, so the Minister for Energy and the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, had set up two companies in Panama just a few days after they were elected to government in 2013. So she had these two companies through the leak. A few months later, she heard about another offshore company, one called 17 Black, but it didn't feature in the leak, and was in fact registered in the United Arab Emirates. And because it wasn't in the leak, she never had access to documentation on that company's owner. So for the last few months of her life, she worked very hard across a number of stories, but especially this, trying to find out who owned 17 Black. But of course, she never did. So she was murdered, again in October 2017. And quite soon after, in fact, immediately after that, because the government's response to her murder was so aggressive, my brothers and I were thrown into campaign mode, and one of the things we did was share a lot of her material with a group of journalists who went on to call themselves the Daphne Project. So journalists across the Guardian, New York Times, Reuters. And what they found almost exactly a year after that, is that the owner of that company, 17 Black, is a man who now stands charged with commissioning her murder. So the three men I mentioned at the start who detonated the bomb pleaded guilty at different points, but they've all pleaded guilty by now. A middleman received a pardon in exchange for evidence on the murder, and another three men are awaiting trial for supplying the bomb. So that's 8 men to kill my mother. But anyway, so I said at the start also that the book was about more than her murder. And it was held up for a long time, for months, in fact, because it took me a long time to appreciate I had to report on my mother like I'd report on anyone else, as though I were writing a magazine profile or something. And I had to speak to her, her old school friends, my grandparents, my father, of course. But then someone put me in touch with her first love, which was, an incredibly moving conversation. And so moving. In a very early draft, I gave it a lot of space, a lot more than it needed anyway. And I share that draft only with my father and my two brothers. And so my middle brother Andrew told me, it's good, but I'm going to email you a few suggested scenes. And the next day I got an email with 10 suggested scenes, each one starring him. Matthew wouldn't read a draft for another 2 years. And my father told me, I liked it, Paul, but do we really need so much on the first boyfriend? And I thought at that point, the book started changing for me, and again became a lot more about her, and as I said, the fullness of her life.